King of Podcasts Radio Network proudly presents the Broadcasters Podcast. Here is the King of Podcasts.
15 years later, one of the groups that could be best resembled to be this modern generation's version of the Beatles, Oasis, to say it with an accent, returning, reuniting. They'll be playing 10 dates at Wembley Stadium. They'll be opening up, they'll be featured at the Glastonbury Festival next year. So in the UK, some of the major locations to be for concerts next summer, they're already setting things up from Oasis. I always ask myself, when I look at music that comes from other countries, especially with the UK, you know, we've had British invasions several times. 60s, 80s. Why didn't the 90s really have us getting engulfed into a British invasion? Because one thing is, I always felt like I understand living in the moment that Oasis, we had alternative music. We first had grunge that really came into play with Pearl Jam or Stone Temple Pilots or Soundgarden and Nirvana. And that was what we had in terms of what rock was becoming to us, converting away from the late 80s, early 90s, from the Cinderellas, the Skid Rows, the Poisons. It was a complete sea change of music. And what led on the other side of the pond for us that we really didn't pay attention enough to was Oasis. And the groups that came along with that, that's Blur and Pulp. You know, we had Radiohead would also be part of that category, I would say. You could say Primal Scream. You know, there's others that are put into that mix as well. But it was one thing where, even in the early 90s, there were certain groups that never got much of a play from us. Happy Mondays never got that kind of feel to us. We never got The Farm. We never had any of those groups really come off like that. It was just something that, you know, we didn't have the internet and we didn't have social media. We didn't have streaming. Streaming today would have made and would now make Oasis popular. No doubt about it. There is a control as to what was being done. And you know what? I went through Google Gemini, and I actually asked the questions about what was going on, why we didn't get the advantage of the music that's out there. We always hear about the feud between the Gallaghers, Noel and Liam. But my thing is the music, because the music was very good. Look, when I look at my listing on Spotify of the songs that I have picked up now, because it took me a while for myself, while I was setting up a list of music for starts basically at the tail end of the late 80s, early 90s. I would say basically when Napster and the internet first came to be, when we could start streaming music online and physical units started to become threatened. Okay. For me, I started looking at the list of music that I had at that time, you know, and I was saying to myself, what songs are there, not just from the US, but from the UK? This was a couple of years ago. And I was trying to go through and search through music that I wanted to go and find out, because one of the things that really got me interested so much in music in the UK was because of the fact that, you know, there are various programs of music that they had over there in the UK that resonated and became, and we had American versions of our own. For the shindig that we had here in the US, they had Ready, Steady, Go. For American Bandstand, they had Top of the Pops. And when I started seeing somebody up on YouTube putting down the yearbooks of Top of the Pops, they would have all these different years showing from 1976. And at one point they headed up to about 1990. And then they didn't do any for a while. But what I saw was of that group and what Top of the Pops meant on the history of the show itself told me that they were much more in tune with connecting with the music labels, getting artists closer to the audience and having more performances. And then on top of that, you might have had other shows that were also complimentary for the music crowds, live music, when it came to Midnight Special here or in concert, Don Kirshner's in concert. In the UK, they had the Tube, but before that, they had the Old Grey Whistle Test. All this music that you would go ahead and learn about. And, for the BBC, to give you the access to certain artists that I've never heard about before. When you see the stories of those shows and the music they portrayed on television, it was as if, somewhere in the 80s, things kind of just changed and the live music on television, having performances like we normally saw, they were changing, and that was because of MTV. I mean, one of the things is that MTV ultimately changed what music television was for us. And did MTV, when it comes to MTV, they were the arbiters of what music would go out there first. So for them, the box also to an extent, but not so much. But MTV were the arbiters. VH1, that's what we had. In the 90s, it was very much what was being played on MTV, which was being less and less, because by that point in the mid-90s, we had less music videos on and much more programming. Because it already started changing by that point. It was inevitable. Like, you weren't going to watch anything, in prime time, you're going to have other shows going on, because in the 90s, we also know that a lot of shows just started changing. It was just, original program was going to work best for them. They were not going to just keep running music videos because they had changed it. When I go ahead and look to Gemini as to what they said about this time, Oasis and their career, the difference between what we are able to go ahead and define who Oasis is here in the States compared to those in the UK. It's a much different story. Oasis is grand. What would be the best example of a group that would be near the size of Oasis in terms of their library and their music? I'm trying to figure out what would be the best example. It would be kind of like maybe Metallica, but I mean, Metallica was not the superstars that you would say. Like, honestly, it was strong rock that crossed over mainstream for the UK. Here, it stayed within the rock realm. It never made it to mainstream. I mean, there's not anybody I can think of that really gives me like that example up to that level, because Oasis really did have that level. So for them, they had massive success in the UK. First of all, the album that broke them and made them on the spot, definitely maybe, was The Story Morning Glory, followed up in 1995. And there were two songs specifically that the U.S. resonated with for whatever reason. And that was Wonderwall and Champagne Supernova. That was it. But Oasis struggled to achieve a level of mainstream impact in the U.S. Radio didn't play it here. And there was a change in radio. Remember, because we had a change of where Top 40 radio wasn't the same anymore. Top 40 wasn't anymore consumed to what happened with all different types of music being played on one station. Okay, so if there was somebody that was more urban or R&B or soul related, or somebody more rock related or dance related, they would all come into one station as a top 40 station. In the 80s, that's what it was. All of our major great radio stations did that. But deregulation changed all that. As I always say, 1994, what a year for music, by the way. In Britain, you have to think about it like this. The artists and the music that was coming out that really just stood out in the time that they had, that defined that year, just in the UK alone. You had Oasis come out with Definitely Maybe. There in the UK, they had Jeff Buckley, who had an album called Grace. You had Portishead. You had Blur with Park Life. You had Hole with Live Through This. You had Manic Street Preachers with the Holy Bible. Nas Illmatic. Orbital with Snivelization. You had The Prodigy, which, I mean, again, really out there, acidy type of rock out there. Music of the Jilted Generation. You had Suede with Dogman Star, another Britpop group that also never really got much play over here. Never did. Tori Amos Under the Pink, also under the spotlight. I mean, of course, American artist, but, there wasn't much said about Tori Amos and what she did. She just kind of also under the radar. Like Tori Amos, I kind of compared to Lana Del Rey. Is that a pretty good example? And Underworld also came out that year with Dub No Bass with My Headman. Now, 94 was was one of those remarkable 90s years of music that we had that was just out there to compete. So there was a lot of music, obviously, in the States that was going to go ahead and compete along with what was happening here, that they were trying to go ahead and, make a mark for themselves. So Oasis was in a very crowded market in the U.S. And in the same vein, the U.S. had their music crossing over to the U.K. in imports, but Britpop was going to make the day because, UK is going to support their artists first and foremost. So the album, What's the Story of Morning Glory, went to number 4 on the Billboard 200 albums chart and was quadruple platinum in the U.S. So as an album, it sold well. It was successful. Of the songs on the album, Wonderwall was their most iconic song. It got number 8 in the Billboard Hot 100. That was the one song that you could hear on every rock station around the country. Heavy radio airplay, popular culture reference. So that was the one that hit right there. But for some people, if you didn't pay attention to the album, you didn't realize how good they were. And there was something where they just did that. Now, what Google Gemini tells me here is that, the band was influenced by the Beatles and the British invasions, right? The rock tradition. Distinctly British. And they try to say that, with their sound, that it was going to be harder for Oasis to go ahead and stand out because of the accent, because of the way they were. I don't believe that. We accepted the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin just as well. Very British. I mean, I think when you listen to the music, it was different. It definitely had a different tinge than what you were listening to. It almost had a feel like of a psychedelic kind of feel to it when I first heard it. And it was just kind of, it was alternative. And for me at that time, I was in college radio and I really didn't get it. And it sucks that I didn't get it back then. I saw the CDs in the studio, never really paid attention to listen to it. I was more of a hip hop head. I was more into hip hop and R&B and freestyle and all this, right? It was just different. And I didn't give myself a chance to listen to rock music until I got older. It's one of those things. You kind of just go into one genre or another, and then you open yourself up. And college did open me up to other music. I mean, it was my first real exposure to a wide sense of music because the music was there to listen to. So much. And I just feel horrible that I didn't get into that sooner. Even with Nirvana, I wasn't really big into them so much at that point. But when I look at the list of music that I have right now, on a couple of my playlists right now, on my website, you can find it on kingofpodcasts.com. Okay. I have a plethora of playlists over there. And one of them right now that I have is the Rock Vault. That's one that I've currently put together. And the same music for Oasis also have another list called All the Hits, including the hard rock and rap. You can find that there. They are listed in the Radio Network. If you just go click the Radio Network button through the kingofpodcasts.com website on the homepage, you'll see the Radio Network button. Click through. You'll find my Spotify playlist. So you can go ahead and grab it. And if you want to subscribe to that and follow it, please do. But I noticed for myself to pick up music that I wanted to go and listen to, I chose on the fact that, okay, Champagne Supernova, Wonderwall, obviously were there. And there were other songs I didn't pay attention to that I feel stupid I didn't think about sooner, that I didn't discover after the fact. But honestly, streaming, I'm sure some of you have already noticed this, streaming does really let you open your mind and really help you expand your musical palette. So now, after Wonderwall and Champagne Supernova, which everybody knows, thanks to Top of the Pops and all the appearances they made over there and the number of number one songs that they had in the UK. And by the way, in the same competition with Blur, which boggles the mind that Blur went to Coachella this year, earlier in April, and Damien Albarn was upset that, people didn't know the music. And I'm like, yeah, man, Britpop, we missed out on that. We missed out on it, and I apologize on behalf of the USA for not catching on to that music sooner. Because the alternative stations could have very well given time to the Britpop artists. I think some of them did, obviously, but not close to what it could have been. Because when I listen back to the music, I'm like, this is great music. I don't know why we never got into this, why we were never caught more into this, but the streaming age allows us to have a chance to revisit and give a second listen to the music again. Because I'm telling you, if you didn't listen to Britpop and Oasis, I made a mistake. Don't make it like I did. Explore it. Engulf yourself as to why these two gentlemen and brought the band back together. 15 years. Again, it was like 14 years, 11 months and something from the time they did, since they formed the group. I forget what the story was. It was like these coincidences of 14 years and 11 months and so many days from the time that they broke up, been apart, and coming back together. I forget what the whole story was. But now I discovered Roll With It. Don't Look Back in Anger. Some might say Up in the Sky. Do you know what I mean? Stop Crying Your Heart Out. I'm Out of Time. Lila, go Let It Out. Supersonic. Columbia, I just learned about. And The Importance of Being Idle. These are songs I had never paid attention to. I never knew about. And I blame the radio industry for not letting us get more engulfed with it, because radio should have encompassed this. Oasis didn't get the proper recognition it should have gotten in the U.S. I really do believe that. But of course, I am doing revisionist history, right? Because my retrospective, I have to remember what we were listening to on the radio. We had great stuff on the radio in '94, okay? In the mid-'90s itself. Grunge, alternative rock, and hip-hop. We had Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden with the grunge movement. And you had R.E.M., Smashing Pumpkins, Red Hot Chili Peppers. Significant success for them. Hip-hop, again, was hitting the mainstream. It hit its stride, and this is where it hit the stride of mainstream and never looked back. You have Tupac, Biggie Smalls, Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, mid-'90s, right? And then R&B was dominated right now. You had Mariah Carey, Boyz II Men, Janet Jackson in their prime, and they had it. In the UK, you had Oasis, Blur, Pulp, Suede, celebrating British culture, catchy melodies, anthemic choruses, and directly contrasting with the darker tones of American grunge. Right, it was different, a reaction against the American music invasion. It was British identity and themes of working class life, youth, and optimism. So it resonated with a different nerve. It was also much more positive. Again, it had a different feel to it. And there are other artists that might have felt that they give you that shot of adrenaline that really just makes a difference. I think about like Sex Pistols or the Smiths and Morrissey, things like that. It was different. And why it is that some artists were able to go and come in from the UK and be prominent. Like what? 94, it wasn't that long ago that Depeche Mode was getting really hot out there. And, for years we were still embracing them, but like we had just had Violator out as an album in 91. And they were still kind of moving things, right? It was like there were certain British artists that were making their way and breaking through. But it was like the Britpop thing did not come here, and I think it was missed. So their accomplishments of their own with their albums, okay? You had Definitely Maybe was number one on the UK albums chart and the fastest selling debut album in UK history at the time. What's the Story? Morning Glory, number one in the albums chart, one of the biggest best-selling albums in UK history, 4 times platinum here in the US, 15 times platinum in Britain. Smaller population, 15 times platinum. So imagine how many people out of an average probably had an Oasis album or had that particular album. It was that big. Be Here Now, 1997, debuted at number one, fastest selling album in the UK history at that time. 424,000 copies in 1 week. That's a lot for Britain. Because usually for us in the US at that time, 1 million copies of an album was like monster. But almost 500,000 in the UK in that market is monster. It was huge. And songs among that during that particular time in their peak, some might say number one song. Don't Look Back in Anger, number one song. Do you know what I mean? Number one song. Wonderwall peaked at number 2. Again, they had 8 number one singles, multiple top 10 hits throughout their career. And as for their albums, again, What's the Story? Morning Glory was number 4 It got as high as number 4 in the album chart. Be Here Now in 1997 was number 2 in the Billboard 200. Wonderwall hit number 8. Was their highest selling, the highest, most popular song in their catalog in the U.S. on the Billboard Hot 100. Number 8. Number 1 in the modern rock tracks chart for Champagne Supernova. And Live Forever and Don't Look Back in Anger would see moderate success on U.S. and rock and alternative charts. But they didn't chart that well. For whatever reason. Just kind of like held back in the mix. And it would be like that across the board. In Europe, it was always much more prominent than it was over here. And they missed over here. So for them, it was a shame that it didn't go as high as they did. Don't Look Back in Anger got to number 55 in the Billboard Hot 100, 1996. But then you had songs over there in the UK that were top 10, didn't even make a blip on the US charts. And I don't know why we didn't get to that point and why we never got to appreciate that, but it didn't. And it's a shame that it didn't. But that was the whole mix about Britpop in the first place, because it wasn't grunge. Grunge gave us a different feel to it. And, I think the feeling of how the groups looked, there was one thing about the image of the groups that we had when it came to rock music in the U.S., because we had gone from long hair sprayed out, lipstick, makeup, the whole kind of nine, right? And then we moved on to a grunge where it was like very, again, Seattle feel to it. So very grungy looking, the hair's all shaggy, and like it's just a different look altogether. And it changed. But it was very strong. At least a lot of it, what I saw for it, was very guitar rock driven. I mean, same thing was going to be over there, but it was a different sound to it. Now, there was some traction on MTV. They did have Britpop music videos and live performances there. But it never really got much of a hype to it. I think one of the things they were doing as well is that MTV was also starting to format their programming as well to coincide with the fact that alternative wasn't going to get the play like it would be. Sometimes one of the things we still had at that point, if I'm correct, MTV still had 120 minutes. And that was a show that really gave and showcased alternative to another end of that. And I forget when that show actually finished up, but that was one of those shows that might have made it to a point. It was from 86 to 2000, so it would have had this here. But it was alternative. And their deal was they did put a lot of artists that you would have had a chance to find that was mostly British, by the way. Because the artists that you would find over on 120 minutes would be the Jesus and Mary chain. Very early alternative that I never really got caught into, and then I did later. I'm like, what am I doing here? Why am I missing this? James, The Verve, The Replacements, New Order, the Stone Roses. That's another great group for the 90s. Oasis was featured there. Blur, Radiohead, KMFDM, Kate Bush, Ramones, Ecstasy, Morrissey, Smashing Pumpkins were there. They Might Be Giants, Rage Against the Machine, Offspring, Sparkle Horse, Mad Religion, among others. But what happened was that the 120 minutes, they left it to overnights. And for whatever reason, they decided to go and keep it there. So we never got a chance. And the problem is because of the fact they shelved it down so late at night, that's what was unfortunate. It would start at 1 a.m. And this is back, that was 2011 when they had it at 1 a.m. But honestly, it was a late night show. And, one of the things as well, I would imagine is that, somewhere in the mid-90s, we started seeing a lull where it wasn't so much on there like it used to be. But the problem was is that we lost it. And they put it on so late at night. I think it was Saturday nights it used to run, if I'm correct. Friday or Saturday nights, I think it used to run. And, it was okay. It was like, I would catch on to it because I would be kind of interested in what they had. But for whatever reason, MTV, I knew that the audience that they're going to play was very popular. And so certain artists were definitely going to get the front. MTV Raps was very popular at that point. and certain other rock artists would have gotten the point of this, but alternative was put into a category on its own. Radio could have really pulled more out of that. And some did, you could say, but I think they kind of missed out on that. And there was more they could have done. One of the other things that we also missed about that really helped out with Britpop in the UK is that there was an ongoing rivalry between Blur and Oasis because they kept matching up number ones to each other. And they would keep kind of like, okay, who's going on top of the pops next? And it would just be like that. And it just changed. But when it came to alternative music, there was a thought process where any alternative music was begat from rock. And they didn't really give much of the push over to alternative to give these artists here. Because I heard some of the other artists that would have an alternative radio stations and I was like, I'm not so much into it. But I would have loved to have heard from some other markets. I mean, because one of the things is that when it comes to other genres of music, we always did accept imports from other countries. Like for, in my end of the spectrum, one of the things that was very popular, it first came off with the fact that, okay, house music, dance music. Obviously, a lot of that coming here from the U.S., and also in various markets. We had Chicago and Detroit, Miami, I would say also to an extent, New York. You had a lot of house music that was being built up and created. And then Britain and the UK and then Europe basically just took it over. And then it was all these different European artists and all this different European music we would find out about in the early 90s especially, because there were various stations around the country that would play the imports. They would go ahead and cross over, experience and discover the imports, get them here, and go. And you know what? There were just particular record stores that were very good at imports, and we learned about it. And like I know for Power 96 for myself, that station would play exclusives. And it would always be these European imports we'd never hear about from anywhere else. And it was fun because I watched all these retrospectives, all these yearbooks of Top of the Pops, and looking at the BBC music lineup of programming that they had over there, and listening to the songs that they had, and it's saying, I know this song, I know this song, I know this song, because I heard it here. Because it was popular here. But for the rest of America, it wasn't the same. And it's a shame it wasn't the same. I went into Reddit to go and look at the comments that were being said about why didn't Oasis have major success in the U.S. like it did in the UK and other parts of the world. And I wanted to get what some of the comments were, because there are some people that really did put out points about that. They make the point here in this Reddit piece that they never reached the heights of their 90s counterparts like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Smashing Pumpkins, Soundgarden, Foo Fighters, Red Hot Chili Peppers in America. And some of the points that were being said was because of the feud that they had. That there was going to be a U.S. tour for them that ended up getting canceled or getting screwed around because of the ongoing infighting between Liam and Noel. And obviously those relationships that also came into that as well. So one person on here in this Reddit thread says that Americans didn't get the Gallaghers with their attitude over the long term. Their sound wasn't what Americans were really listening to at the time. Grunge was much more dominant. Let's face it, Oasis were not grunge. Definitely maybe had the heavier and distorted guitar sound, but What's This Running Morning Glory title track is the only track on that album that comes to a grungy sound. Be Here Now didn't catch on either, and at the end of the day, they just didn't cross over. They had their shot. They did get featured on MTV Unplugged, and Liam blew it for them. MTV Unplugged back then had the power to influence the catapult bands to another level of recognition, so they really fucked it up by not taking advantage. So in 1996, they said that grunge was already being a passing fad, because we were getting a change in the music by that point. And when Oasis did break in the U.S., it was with their ballads. That Oasis's enormous popularity in the UK perceived the session with the Beatles and the fact they never did a proper tour of the U.S. in the heyday had as much to do with it as anything. Put a bad taste in people's mouths, rightly or wrongly. They also had bad timing in 1997, as the Be Here Now album was treated as a big deal in the U.S. and went to number 2, but has been discussed ad nauseum, and it's not as good as the first two. But it's probably better than some of the music we have today, as a matter of fact. Another person writes here that the U.S. is significantly larger than the U.K., so if a band makes it in one state or region, doesn't mean that it will translate across the board. And the musical scene was very limiting at the time. All radio stations were dedicated to a specific type of music. It was being narrowcasted. The genres were getting pinpricked down to smaller formats, especially in the early 90s. Because, number one, there was a change to the Billboard algorithm, to their chart system, their methodology. Because in 1991, as I've said before, they started really taking some of the Hot 100 and then they wanted to go ahead and compartmentalize it into other charts. And because American Top 40 no longer applied the actual Billboard Hot 100 methodology anymore, as of November 1991, they stopped it. They decided to go to the mainstream chart, which was much more pop friendly than anything else rock or rap friendly at that time. Because it couldn't be one network, one station that could cover all this music because there was so much coming out, and the variety and the diversity of it, it came with different music that was a little more risque, a little more vulgar, a little more violent, and that was the part that people were kind of swaying away from. So a lot of people are going to say that it was the fact that they did not have a U.S. tour. And when they never got to do that, that hurt them ultimately, which the thing is, no matter what in the UK, you have to understand the fact of the matter is that for all these artists, if they become successful in America, they're made for life. I mean, they are successful for the level of success they had in the UK, but they had super amount of success in the UK. But they could have been very successful if the US could have caught on. And unfortunately, they didn't get a chance to do that because of their own infighting, because things just happened as a band as they were. So let's find out what it was that broke them up in the first place and where they missed out on the opportunity to go ahead and work more forward on this. And the other thing, too, that we have to make mention of is that Oasis, because of the fact that the Gallaghers, Liam and Noel, were so against talking to each other, they're infighting, their feuding is of lore. I mean, they really did hate each other. We all know the story. But there was a lot of insults, incidents, and infighting. And it was August 28th, 2009. The band broke up minutes before they were set to take the stage at the Rock Insane Festival in Paris. So where they come from of their highlights or low points, I take it from NPR first. April 1994. The brothers had an interview with NME's John Harris, and they were bickering with each other about the meaning of rock and roll, a drunken incident on a ferry several months earlier, and how much they hated each other, among other things. September 94, in a concert in Los Angeles, Liam hits Noel over the head with a tambourine, slings insults to both the band and the American audience. Noel storms off and briefly quits the band, but rejoins later that tour and uses the inspiration for the track Talk Tonight. Spring 1995. While recording What's the Story Morning Glory, Liam brings a group of visitors to the studio while Noel is trying to work. Noel, trying to get them to leave, ends up hitting Liam on the head with a cricket bat. Years later, the rescued cricket bat was sold at auction with a certificate of authenticity. August 1996, at the MTV Unplugged taping, Liam pulls out of the performance saying he had a sore throat, then spends the entire performance heckling his brother from the crowd and drinking champagne. And later that month, Liam also pulls out of a U.S. tour just before it starts, ends up joining just a few days in, but the tour is canceled after 2 weeks. A lot of stuff on stage. Notice that it was all the touring stuff that really came out about this, but there was just so much more to it. And the one thing that was always talked about for the last 15 years is that all these artists continue to go ahead, and these two would continue to bicker with each other, and there was just no end of it. And they were always kind of saying never say never, especially Noel. But Noel Gallagher kept working. He kept putting out albums, and I know Liam kept working on things, and they were just moving along on their own. But never to see that group to get back together again. In 2019, Liam Gallagher did say he was ready to reconcile with Noel, saying, quote, "The most important thing is about me and him being brothers. He thinks I'm desperate to get the band back together for money, but I didn't join the band to make money. I joined the band to have fun and see the world." I don't know what his problem is. I think he just wanted to go away and do a solo career and get all the coin and be surrounded by all the yes men you can fire and hire whenever he wants. You can't do that with me. And by the way, since they have started announcing their reunion tour, they had to add additional shows in Manchester, London, and Edinburgh. Of course, in Manchester, that's where they're from. One of the arguments you can make about Oasis is the fact that they deserve to be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, even though they might not have gotten the recognition in the U.S. like they could have. And the other thing, too, is that while they're putting out more than a dozen dates in the UK, the question would be, how well would they perform in the U.S. if they go ahead and tour over here? Are there a lot of people out there that are really very much interested in the Gallaghers and what they're going to do? Like, that's a good question. So, Classic Rock and Culture put out a story and said about, the argument of putting them out there, of making them in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Noel Gallagher mentions in 1994, quote, "You dream of being on top of the pops, you dream of being in the back of posh cars, of not having to pay for anything, of loose women and all the rest of it. That's all come true, so you might as well enjoy it while you can before it finishes. You're only going to get 5 years out of all this." 6 of their 7 studio albums have made the top 25 in the US, and all 7 made it to the number 1 slot in the UK, just to give you the example. They are the most influential band of the Britpop era. So while America was being introduced to grunge bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Alice in Chains is another great group, right? A lot of music we had back then. Britain was experiencing a whole other kind of musical movement in the form of Britpop. Suede, Pulp, The Verve, Oasis. Having a song with the level of cultural impact that Wonderwall had is a dual-edged sword. Both Gallagher brothers have spoken about their love-hate relationship with the song that effectively cemented them as history-making musicians. It was an anthemic ballad that was recorded in just a handful of takes, becoming an inescapable. For one reason or another, they continue to resonate with listeners and remains as recognizable as it did then. October 2020 became the very first song from the 90s to reach over 1 billion streams on Spotify. That's a notable point. And they're not the only artists that have had their own sibling rivalry. Dire Straits, Beach Boys, Bee Gees, Heart, and the Kinks also include that. In the 2020 film, The Bee Gees' How Can You Mend a Broken Heart, Noel said this, quote, "I always said that making music with your family is equally the greatest strength and the greatest weakness you could ever have in a musical partnership. You got the brothers singing, and when you got brothers singing, it's like an instrument that nobody else can buy. You can't go buy that sound in the shop." Their influence is very important because their influence ranged from the Beatles to the Sex Pistols and carried the torch of rock and roll into the 21st century. There was a running joke they would say that Oasis was essentially the world's most popular Beatles tribute band, with a very accurate assessment that the Fab Four were a major influence of Oasis' songwriting. But this is a crucial mission to the Rock Hall of Fame, is that music does get passed down, the torch does get passed down. In Oasis' case, they fuse elements of British rock stalwarts like the Beatles, the Stones, the Who, and then they had the non-conformist, self-deprecating approaches of bands like the Sex Pistols, the Smiths, and the Cure. There's 3 great groups right there. And in turn, another generation of bands was influenced by Oasis. You could say Coldplay, Arctic Monkeys, The Killers, among others. That's not bad. That's a pretty good example there. Not so much Coldplay. Just saying. Nothing against Coldplay. But that's the thought. Oasis. What a group. What an amazing time of music. And so I'm glad we have all this music. And what would it be like if Oasis decided to go ahead and put another album together? If they got through the tour and said, fuck it, let's just do another album. I don't think it would get just thrown into the idea that, oh, you know what, Oasis is just a band out there. That's just their following fans that'll be out there. Something tells me that when Oasis starts getting themselves off the ground once again, back on tour, I know right off the bat, pretty sure that the Spotify charts are starting to go ahead and see Oasis back up on those charts once again. I believe that's going to happen. Well, I can tell you right off the bat, Wonderwall has made it onto the UK charts for Spotify, number 156. And it will probably make its way back up once again. Just a matter of time. November 2023, Noel Gallagher also spoke about the fact of why America didn't take on Oasis like it could have. And I want to close out with this. He says, quote, America couldn't handle the fact that Oasis didn't give a fuck about anything. They wouldn't go the extra mile for us because we wouldn't go the extra mile for them. And I will say this too. The one thing that also made me feel a bit of a point when it came to the Gallaghers and Oasis is the fact that I never got to hear these guys talk. If I knew the attitude, if I really did understand their music, I would have paid attention to that. And the attitude they have today, I should have like fallen for these guys and like what it should have been like part of my library, and I should have bought their albums back then. But he goes on to say, I think that's the reason we never really had a number one album in America. They wouldn't go the extra mile for us because we wouldn't go the extra mile for them. That's why we've never been nominated for a Grammy. You've got to do all that stuff over there. You got to do all that kind of fake it a little bit, and we just couldn't do it, which is why we'd always stall number 2. Yeah, that's true. And it's also kind of nice just to go ahead and close things out and just say, you know what? Noel has been asked, Noel or Liam, they've always been asked, are you guys going to get back together? Well, now it's a time where they can kind of like say, you know what? Fuck off. Yes. Go buy a ticket. Come to the show. See us. And there you go. That's it. Okay. We're coming back. I just hope that the fans out there will appreciate what's being done right now with these guys coming back, because I think it's a wonderful thing. I know my appreciation for Oasis came too late for their peak of their career, but I don't think it's too late for them to go ahead and start seeing success again should the tour go well and another album comes into works. Come back next week for another Broadcasters podcast. Remember, content is king, and the control of your content is in your hands.